During World War II, there were many barbaric and horrific torture methods used by different armies. Some of the toughest armies, such as the Japanese, utilised terrifying prisoner of war camps, and they were known for the deaths of millions of civilians before and during the conflict. But within concentration camps, there were many brutal SS guards who inflicted torture on a number of inmates to punish them. It was during World War II that the biggest cost came to civilians, and the horrors that many people were subjected to was terrible. In this video we look at the disturbing torture methods used during World War II. Welcome to the Fortress. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Many different countries during the Second World War fell under German occupation as the Wehrmacht and the army rampaged into their lands. There were lots of women inside of countries who began to take lovers who were invaders, and the soldiers saw many of these women as exotic and different to what was at home. Inside of Britain, for example, there were lots of women who married former German and Italian prisoners of war who were held inside of prisoner of war camps within the country. Inside of France there was a very strict impression of women who slept with the enemy and who became the girlfriends of German soldiers, and it would later come back to haunt many, as they would be punished very badly. The French saw a boom of around 200,000 babies who were born to French mothers and German fathers, and this was the case inside of all occupied nations and lands, with German men having relations with local women that resulted in children. There were many women who suffered very heavily at the hands of the invading forces and troops. There was a huge amount of assault, and the Red Army soldiers, for example, were known for this at the end of the war, as they made inroads towards Germany and the heart of Hitler's Reich. When the Germans invaded different countries, they made themselves at home quickly inside of these lands. They also began to see the local women, and many forged relationships that would last even after the war. Many women were seen posing in post-war photographs and images, wearing their boyfriends' uniforms, and lots of German soldiers went on the rampage inside of Paris, and they would visit different brothels in the city, and they viewed Paris as a huge cat house where they could play and have their fun. A lot of French women believed that the German men would offer them a future away from their current lives and their troubles, and they wanted to begin a family and set up a whole new life. Women at the end of the war, as mentioned, did follow their husbands, and they married them, and some even moved to Germany, and there were a number of German soldiers who were locked inside of prisoner of war camps, and their girlfriends even went with them. But the French resistance wanted to send a clear message to those inside of France, and because of this they instigated a brutal and ruthless punishment method within the nation. They created the ugly Carnival, which was a form of public humiliation given out to those women who had allegedly had relationships with the enemy, and this began in the aftermath of the D-Day invasions, after the Allies were advancing from Normandy and pushing the Germans back. The Allied soldiers, as mentioned, who witnessed this, were disgusted by the actions of the members of the French resistance, but they began to understand the hatred that the French population and resistance had for the German soldiers who had put their nation to the sword. The French hated living under German and Nazi occupation. However, the women of the ugly Carnival were traumatised by their fate. They were forced in front of huge crowds to have their heads shaved. This was something that had been done in Europe for a number of centuries, and it was very humiliating. These women had their hair roughly cut and shaved by members of the resistance, and this was very painful. The women were photographed visibly incredibly upset at this, and some were unmoved by their treatment, not wanting to give the baying crowd an inch to add to their torment. Many members of the crowd spat at the women, threw things at them, and also kicked and beat them when they were forced to walk and run through the streets of the French towns, running the gauntlet. There were many women who were beaten so badly inside of Paris they were actually murdered and killed. Many of the women were left bloodied by the attackers, and on their heads they had swastikas drawn on them, and these were often also painted in tar or lipstick. The victims and women were ordered to stand on carts, and they were paraded on settlements and towns, and it was incredibly dangerous. One onlooker claimed that, in the hands of their tormentors, they had the look of a hunted animal. But the Allied soldiers documented what they saw inside the towns and cities, and they said, the French were rounding up collaborators, cutting their hair off and burning it in huge piles, which one could smell miles away. Women collaborators were forced to run the gauntlet and were really beaten. There were a number of men who were accused of aiding the Germans, who were also subjected to this sort of treatment, and some were even executed. The French resistance wanted to send a clear message against the occupiers, and this was done in different French towns and cities, and many women en masse were subjected to it. There was one woman inside of a French town who had not slept with the enemy, but she had been employed as a cleaner within a local German army building or headquarters, but she was also forced to undergo the ugly carnival. There was also another woman who was a schoolteacher, who was forced to put up the German soldiers in her house, and she too was not spared the ordeal. But many of the women who were tortured were prostitutes who had slept with the enemy for money, but some had been forced to sleep with the Germans based on survival to ensure better treatment and food for their families and children. Some believed that the only way to survive was to do this, but they were then looked down upon for this sort of behaviour. The ugly carnival continued, and one man who witnessed it claimed that, "I watched an open lorry drive past to the accompaniment of boos and catcalls from the French populace, with a dozen miserable women in the back, every hair on their heads shaved off. They were in tears, hanging their heads in shame. Whilst disgusted by this cruelty, I reflected that we British had not known invasion or occupation for some 900 years, so we were not the best judges." Another witness described what he saw and stated, "I saw 4 girls who had been led through the streets and I rushed towards them to take a photograph. At once I found myself at the front of the procession, and the local people thought I was a female soldier who had captured them or something like that, and I was kissed and congratulated at the same time as slaps and spits rained down on the unfortunate girls." In total, at least 20,000 French women were subjected to the ugly carnival. It was a very harrowing ordeal for them. There were lots of people within France who actually did not like the resistance rules on this sort of behaviour, and one man claimed that there would be strong reprisals against anyone who shaved the heads of women. In fact, resistance members who did not like this sort of behaviour also reprimanded young children who tormented the women who had been subjected to this. One of the most famous accounts of the ugly carnival was against a 23-year-old woman named Simone Tussaud, and she was a mother who was photographed by Robert Capa on the 16th of August 1944, carrying her baby in her arms. She had been in a relationship with a German soldier since 1941, and the couple did have a daughter who was caught up in the proceedings. She was accused of telling the Gestapo about her neighbours, who were then sent to concentration camps, and she was forced to carry her daughter in her arms after she had her head shaved, and her forehead had been branded with a red-hot iron. She was subjected to a terrible treatment by the people that day, and she was then jailed, but her ordeal continued to haunt her, and she died much earlier than she should have because of the horror that had happened to her. But the ugly carnival was a terrifying torture ordeal for over 20,000 women inside of a country which had suffered during the Second World War. Many people had been deported to concentration camps inside of France, and the occupation for many was very rough. But the ugly carnival was a shocking sight, as the women were seen with their heads shaved and covered in swastikas, as people kept trying to attack and beat them. France had to recover, and in many ways it did, but the ugly carnival was seen by many as a backward step and a savage one. Sachsenhausen concentration camp was a camp where death lurked around every single corner. There were 200,000 prisoners that passed through the site's barbed wire fences, and over 50,000 people were killed in it. This even included the oldest son of Joseph Stalin, Yakov Zhugashvili, who walked into the electric fence around the camp, and he was then shot by a German guard. It was a ruthless camp where inmates were forced to work incredibly hard, and they were given poor food rations, and the inmates were subjected to violence and beatings at the hands of the guards. The prisoners had very poor living conditions, and there were executions carried out in public at times, and the SS guards, even in 1942, created Station Z, a purpose-built execution unit just outside the camp's walls on an industrial unit, and this contained a number of execution chambers where prisoners could be shot or hanged as well as tortured, and there were also 4 crematoria for burning the bodies, and also a sand pit, which was used as an execution trench where firing squads regularly shot into their victims. Torture at Sachsenhausen was very common. The prisoners were often forced to conduct excruciating long punishing days of exercise, and found at the camp was a marching strip around the perimeter of the roll call yard, and here inmates were forced to march over a variety of different terrains to test military footwear, which would then be sent to the German soldiers if they were any good. The inmates were often forced to cover up to 25 miles a day. They were given hardly any food, and many died from exhaustion because of this, and the guards whipped and beat them to walk quicker and faster. Some of the prisoners were even given performance-enhancing drugs to then trial the boots which were being made for the army. Many prisoners were also kept in isolation and in prison, and the guards even utilised medieval-style torture methods such as the strappado, where prisoners were hanged in the air from their wrists, which were secured behind their backs. But one of the torture methods used upon the prisoners was exclusive to Sachsenhausen, and it involved physical exercise, and it was known as the Sachsenhausen salute. The guards of the camp came up with this, and they wanted to inflict the most amount of physical pain as possible. The salute was where an inmate was forced to assume a position where they had to squat with their arms stretched out in front of them. The salute was where a prisoner was forced to assume a position where they had to squat with their arms stretched out in front of them. They could be forced to remain in this position for hours on end, and if they fell over or stood up due to the pain on their limbs and muscles, then they would be beaten by the guards and battered. Sometimes the guards would even place weights on the inmates whilst performing the salute, which put even more strain and pain on the muscles. It was excruciating, and some inmates could be forced to walk around the camp in this position if they could move. The Sachsenhausen salute was a simple and straightforward torture method, which was performed in public to make the life of inmates painful. It was common to see groups of prisoners around the roll call yards being forced into this position for some time, squatting with their arms stretched out, and it was a ruthless torture method that inflicted strain and pain unnecessarily. It helped many of the guards to gain a reputation for being brutal overseers, and it was a simple torture method that did not require any other torture or instruments. It just needed overseers who were ardent in forcing prisoners into the position, and who would punish those if they moved from it. One of the most public punishments used inside of Auschwitz was flogging. This was where a victim was beaten with a whip or a rod or other weapon, and usually someone was struck across their back. It is a punishment that dates back centuries, but inside of Auschwitz flogging was so brutal that it could result in death. Usually the camp authorities declared that the maximum amount of lashes that could be given was 25 strikes at one point, but some sadistic guards went further, inflicting many more. This was known to have been fatal, and some prisoners died from their pain as they were secured to the whipping post, and other guards chose to use heavier weapons, which inflicted even more pain. Inside of Auschwitz, flogging was administered, as mentioned, on flogging posts or whipping posts, and also on stools as prisoners were forced to sit down, often in front of many other inmates, and they were then struck many different times. But other SS guards innovated in one of the most sadistic ways possible, and they considered how to make flogging more brutal and severe, and what they came up with was known as the Auschwitz goat. This was a simple change to flogging, and it was also used in different concentration camps all inside the Third Reich. The Auschwitz goat was simple. It was a box in which the prisoner's feet were secured and locked inside of. They were then pushed over resting on the goat. This was a wooden table which was curved at each side, and the prisoner and victim was then forced forward onto the table. Their arms were pulled forward, stretching them slightly. With the victim locked in this position, the guard then using a whip, heavy stick or other object, then rained down blow after blow onto the inmate, who was forced to scream out the numbers of the lashes in German. If they lost count, then the whipping would begin all over again, and some guards ramped up the force of the whip with every hit and strike. The goat was also used as punishment in the yard near to Block 11, the previously mentioned torture block, and it could be moved around the site when it was needed. What is sadistic about the Auschwitz goat is that the guards inside the deadliest concentration camp decided to make a more sadistic and brutal punishment method to make the lives of prisoners much more difficult. The victim was left exposed on the goat, making their punishment more brutal and ruthless, and when done in public, it had a profound effect on the other prisoners, as they saw the suffering that it caused. It was more likely to make a prisoner fall into line, seeing this sort of action. There was a huge number of torture methods used inside of Auschwitz, and some of these were inspired by the medieval period. Within the torture block of Block 11, there were a number of standing cells in the dungeons. These were tiny cells in which a prisoner could not sit down or crouch, They were forced to stand for days on end, which was harrowing, and they were starved. One prisoner was so desperate that he even ate his own shoes inside of the Sterbunker, or the standing cells. But these were inspired by medieval oubliettes, dungeons found within castles, where prisoners were simply forgotten. Used inside of Auschwitz and other concentration camps was a form of medieval torture, which was made infamous during the Spanish Inquisition, and this was a variation of the strapado. This was a structure in which a victim was suspended from their arms, which had been tied behind their backs, and this caused immense pain and suffering, and it was often enough for someone to submit to what their torturers wanted. This was used inside of Auschwitz and was known as the post. Punishment by post was frequently used within the deadliest concentration camp, and to begin with, it was initially carried out inside the main Auschwitz site of Auschwitz I. The prisoners were hung from hooks on high posts, and they had their hands tied behind their backs with a rope or chain that was then held at a height which made it impossible for a prisoner to touch the ground with their feet. They were hoisted up in the same way as the strapado, and with their arms behind their backs, it caused immense pain and brutal pain. The intense suffering caused by the twisting of the shoulders often led to victims to pass out, and their muscles and ligaments in their shoulders were often torn by the punishment, and their shoulders could also dislocate during the ordeal. What was also shocking was that the torture method of the post had a more dangerous effect than just the physical pain inflicted on the sufferer. If a prisoner of Auschwitz was said to have been too ill or weak to work, or they were injured, they would be selected to be sent to the gas chambers, and because of this, those prisoners who were damaged by their ordeals on the post were then sent to the gas chambers, where they were exterminated. This added to the death toll of Auschwitz, but ordeals on the post could last for 1 hour, and in some cases there were people who were suspended by their shoulders for many hours on end, and this punishment was repeated. If they gave over information to their captors, they would be spared any more punishment, but this was also performed inside of Block 11, and also in public in a similar way as flogging. The post of Auschwitz did travel in its use, as inside different concentration camps there were other guards who utilised similar style punishment. Within the forests of Buchenwald concentration camp, there was a brutal guard known as the Hangman of Buchenwald, who suspended prisoners from their arms high up in the trees, and he was so barbaric that this guard was even sacked because of his terrifying actions that he was responsible for. This guard was said to have been even too much for the SS. But the post of Auschwitz at the end of the war, when the site was liberated, was shown to the Soviet liberators, and there is footage of a group of prisoners showing their liberators the torture posts and how these were used. It was certainly one of the most painful and dangerous torture methods deployed within Auschwitz concentration camp. Flogging is referred to the punishment method in which someone beat another person with a whip or a rod, and this was mostly performed with the victim being hit across their back. It was used as punishment inside the military in some cases, as well as against those who were enslaved throughout history. It was used as punishment inside of the armies to prevent mutiny and also deal with it, and at times others were forced to witness this method being used, as it was seen as having deterrent value. During the Second World War it was performed upon prisoners who found themselves at the mercy of German officers and soldiers. Hitler issued the Commissar Order, in which all Soviet commissars were to be executed and shot. However, different commanders ordered different directives as to how prisoners of war should be punished, and how information should be extracted from them through different ways. One German commander of the 12th Infantry Division issued a directive stating, "The carrying of information is mostly done by youngsters in the ages of 11 to 14, and that, as the Russian is more afraid of the truncheon than of weapons, flogging is most advisable as a method for interrogation." With this he was ordering his soldiers to interrogate captives using flogging, as they did not like it, and it was said to have been very painful. Flogging, of course, could result in death, as it was very dangerous at times, especially as a man armed with the whip could rain down dozens and dozens of blows. Inside of the concentration camps, this was very common punishment, and was carried out regularly upon those individuals who were locked up inside of them. It was common to see daily floggings inside the roll call yards, with prisoners being led up to the post where they were secured before the SS guard took the whip to them. Inside of Auschwitz, the largest and deadliest concentration camp of the Third Reich, flogging was used a lot, and was particularly common during evening roll call. A prisoner was brought up to a stool and was then placed on this, and they were then whipped and flogged, but then the SS guards innovated in the most brutal ways to punish people, and a special flogging contraption known as a goat was developed and used during flogging. The prisoner's feet were placed inside the wooden box, and then the prisoner was pushed over and would rest on the goat, and their arms were then stretched forward. The SS guard would then, with the prisoner locked in this position, begin the flogging process with a whip, a heavy stick, or some other object. With this punishment, the victim was forced to scream out the number of lashes in German, and if they lost count, then the punishment would begin all over again. The maximum amount of lashes which could be given was 25, and this was known to have been fatal, as someone could die from the injuries sustained, especially if they were beaten with a bullwhip or a heavy weapon. But some SS guards continued to rain down blow after blow onto the prisoners, and they had little regard for this. Flogging was also done inside of the torture and punishment block of Block 11, a brick-built building inside of Auschwitz I, which was synonymous with the brutal treatment of prisoners who were interrogated terribly. Inside Block 11, other methods such as the standing cells were used, but flogging was used by some guards as light punishment, but it could of course be fatal. Inside other camps such as Dachau, commandants wrote the rules on punishment, and they outlined the use of flogging in this. But it was a torture and punishment method used throughout the Second World War and inside the concentration camps, and of course this was a method that had a long history, but its use in the Second World War is linked to the further suffering of many people inside the harshest places inside the Third Reich. The Bataan Death March was a forcible movement of 75,000 American, Allied and Filipino prisoners of war to the destination of Camp O'Donnell. The prisoners were captured following the Battle of Bataan, and the Japanese did not realise that they then had to deal with as many prisoners of war as they would. Because of this, they marched the prisoners around 65 miles, and there was a significant amount of horror conducted on the march. Anyone who fell behind would be shot or bayoneted by the guards. One account of this treatment from an eyewitness claimed, "Before we could grasp what was happening, the giant had swung his sword. I remember how the sun flashed on it. There was a swish and a kind of chopping thud, like a cleaver going through beef. The captain's head seemed to jump off his shoulders. It hit the ground in front of him and went rolling crazily from side to side between the lines of prisoners. The body fell forward. I have seen wounds, but never such a gush of blood as this. The heart continued to pump for a few seconds, and at each beat there was a great spurt of blood. The white dust around our feet was turned into crimson mud. All along the march there was horror, and there were clean-up squads who followed up and executed anyone who was left behind. The cruelty of the guards was so that the victims were given little food, if anything, and water, but they also subjected the prisoners to what became known as sun torture, or sun treatment. The heat in the sun was blistering on the march, and the guards used the heat and conditions to subject the prisoners to a horrific ordeal. The victims would be forced to sit in the open, with no hat or protection from the sun, for long periods of time. They became very dehydrated and sunburned, which caused serious problems. The sun torture was done to make the suffering much worse, and from the heat there would be of course many other medical problems caused, from diarrhoea to also sickness. One prisoner who was subjected to this torture claimed, "Eventually the road became so crowded we were marched into a clearing. Here for 2 hours we had our first taste of the oriental sun treatment, which strains the stamina and weakens the spirit. The Japanese seated us on scorching ground, exposed to the full glare of the sun. Many of the Americans and Filipinos had no covering to protect their heads. I was beside a small bush, but it cast no shade because the sun was almost directly above us. Many of the men around me were ill. When I thought I could stand the penetrating heat no longer, I was determined to have a sip of the tepid water in my canteen. I had no more than unscrewed the top when the aluminium flask was snatched from my hands. The Japanese guard who had crept up behind me poured the water into a horse's nose bag, then threw down my canteen. He walked on amongst the prisoners, taking away their water and pouring it into the bag. When he had enough, he gave it to the horse. The prisoners were forced to sit in the heat for some time without any protection, and on the 60-mile march, this would be a regular occurrence. Many prisoners were suffering heavily, and they then, because of the blazing sun, became much sicker. The guards knew what they were doing, and another man who was subjected to this said, "Many of us went crazy, and several died." Wilhelm Boger was a man who joined the Nazi Party early in 1929, and he then became a member of the auxiliary police, before he moved to the political police based in Stuttgart. He attended various Nazi police training schools, and he then became a police commissioner, but as the Second World War broke out, he would be transferred to the state police-led office based in Sachsenhausen. He set up and oversaw the creation of border police stations, but he would then find himself transferred to Auschwitz concentration camp. Inside the site, he first worked in the political department, and in this he was a representative of the Reich Security Main Office, and he was involved in keeping files on different prisoners, and also in keeping security tight within the Auschwitz site. Some other of Wilhelm Boger's responsibilities included the interrogation and torture of those who were suspected of being involved in resistance within Auschwitz, and he got his hands dirty when it came to torturing prisoners. For his crimes that he committed inside of Auschwitz, Wilhelm Boger became infamously known as the Tiger of Auschwitz, and in his role he developed different torture methods to inflict suffering onto the inmates. One of these contraptions was known as the Boger Swing, named after the SS guard who invented it. In this, a prisoner was strapped over a bar, and he was then suspended in the air, and the prisoner would then be battered by other guards until they gave over information regarding resistance inside of Auschwitz. Boger's secretary, after the war, later stated of this torture method that it was a metre-long iron bar, suspended by chains hung from the ceiling. A prisoner would be brought in for questioning, stripped naked and bent over the bar, wrists manacled to ankles. A guard at one side would shove him or her off across the chamber in a long, slow arc, while Boger would ask questions, at first quietly, then barking them out, and at the last bellowing. At each return, another guard, armed with a crowbar, would smash the victim across the buttocks. As the swinging went on, and the wailing victim fainted, they were only revived, only to faint howling again. The blows then continued, until only a mass of bleeding pulp hung before their eyes. Most perished from the ordeal, some sooner, some later. In the end, a sack of bones and flayed flesh and fat was swept along the shambles of that concrete floor to be dragged away. The prisoner could not get away. They were locked in this position for their ordeal. It inflicted terrible injuries, but Wilhelm Boger's crimes inside of Auschwitz continued until the camp was liberated. He was then arrested by the American military police, but he did manage to escape from custody, and he was then found working as a farm worker before he was brought to trial in 1963. He was a defendant in the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials and was charged with aiding and abetting the murder of prisoners. One man who testified about his actions claimed the 5-year-old child, clasping an apple in his hands, had jumped off the truck, filled with other boys and girls, en route to the gas chamber, the witness said. Boger grabbed the crying boy by his feet and hurled him against the nearest wall. Wilhelm Boger was sentenced to life imprisonment with hard labour for being involved in at least 114 cases of murder and accessory to murder in at least 1,000 cases. He did not really admit his crimes during this time, and inside of Auschwitz, the Boger Swing was his torture method that he developed to inflict a huge amount of suffering. This was a horrific ordeal for a prisoner to be subjected to, and it caused death and immense amounts of pain. The Boger Swing was one of the Second World War's most brutal torture methods. When Dachau opened, a speech was made to the SS men who were working there. It summed up the attitude that the guards had towards the staff, and it was said, "Comrades of the SS, you all know what the Führer has called us to do. We have not come here for human encounters with those pigs in there. We do not consider them human beings, as we are, but as second-class people. For years they have been able to continue their criminal existence, but now we are in power. If those pigs had come to power, they would cut off all our heads. Therefore we have no room for sentimentalism. If anyone here cannot bear to see the blood of comrades, he does not belong and had better leave. The more of these pig dogs we strike down, the fewer we need to feed. Over the years they would brutalise many different prisoners from day one. Inside the camp, many medical experiments took place, and the SS doctors would conduct many cruel experiments onto innocent people. There were different people from different countries who were imprisoned there, and the camp was originally designed to hold German and Austrian political prisoners, as well as Jews. There were thousands of members of the clergy who were also held at Dachau. Specifically, there were 19 female guards who served there until the camp was liberated, and most of the guards were men, and it seems that Dachau had a lower percentage of female guards compared to other sites such as Auschwitz and Stutthof. When the camp first opened, the commandant of Dachau, SS officer Theodor Eicher, tried with all means available to him to teach the prisoners nationalistic principles and to drive the internationalist ones out. Many prisoners were political prisoners at this time, and Eicher restructured the camp to be more productive and profitable, and he made sure that the guards of the camp were brutal in their actions and violence towards the prisoners. They wanted Dachau to become an education centre, and they used horrific discipline to force prisoners to conform to what the Nazis wanted them to be. Eicher also then used different methods inside the camp to make the lives of prisoners a misery, and he utilised modern technology, and specifically, he had a loudspeaker system introduced to the camp. To pay for this, the prisoners were forced to donate money and valuables towards this cause, but they were contributing to their own torture. It was said that the prisoners asked to be treated fairly if they donated the money, but the SS guards of course did not tolerate this. Loudspeakers were placed all over Dachau, and they were at times connected to radio stations. However, the speakers would then become a method of sonic torture inflicted upon the inmates. One prisoner said of this torture of Dachau that, when the first sounds came from the speakers, we were sure that the modest amount of rest and quiet normally brought by the evening was gone forever. After a few awkward crows, the beast began to play marches, the Italian Fascist March and the Barnenweiler March. This musical vomit lasted a little while, but then the noise machine began again. In the beginning the radio crackled uninterruptedly with noise. The number of records played was small, but the music had penetrating powers. As if from the halls of Valhalla, a Teutonic bard howled, "To your arms," in a voice that sounded like it came from a wild animal. It continued, "Deutschland, erwache aus deinem schwerem Traum," the song Germany Awake from Your Dreams. This treatment of national awakening through German song lasted well into the night. It concluded with the German national anthem and the Horst Wessel song. So the great mother Germania sat invisibly by the beds of even her most depraved sons, singing them to sleep. The SS officers would play Nazi patriotic music through the speakers to demoralise the prisoners, and they also played Nazi marching music. The prisoners were to begin with allowed to listen to the radio, but this changed, and the loudspeaker system then became something which was used by the commandant of Dachau to scream, screech and launch tirades upon the prisoners. More speakers were installed in the camp, and prisoners were then forced to listen to Nazi music constantly throughout the day. One inmate said it went on constantly, to the point that the inmates did not even notice this. Further radio propaganda broadcasts were heard all around the camp, and this increased around holidays which the Nazis celebrated. During the election processes, the loudspeakers constantly screamed Nazi propaganda, which must have been hard for the prisoners, as they were at the end of the day prisoners of the Nazis, and they were often subject to political rants. Hitler's radio broadcasts were also played, and also Nazi speeches would be piped out to the camp. One prisoner said that, in the late afternoon and early evening, the musical hors d'oeuvres were brought out. Parade marches and jingoistic music by Wagner. It was great difficulty that we digested the turgid speeches of the Führer. Some prisoners were even allowed to vote inside Dachau when they were held there, and they were then forced to vote for the Nazis over the loudspeaker system in the camp. But Dachau was seen as the first camp, and it was also a site where the Nazis tried to make prisoners go mad, and bombarding them with political speeches, Nazi music and ranting was a constant reminder of their plight. The radio broadcasts were often pumped out whilst prisoners had to stand at roll call. They then had to listen to them for hours. They were being constantly reminded that they were the enemies of the Nazis, that they were imprisoned at the hands of them. One inmate claimed that, For us, the radio did not mean something like entertainment, but a new form of torment for our souls. We had to listen to the speeches of the Führer, and to him brutally insulting ourselves and our comrades. We were forced to listen to songs that just as much mocked our beliefs. During torture and also interrogations inside of Dachau, music was often used too. On Sunday mornings, prisoners were taken to a small house behind the guards' barracks and rooms. They were then beaten by clubs and weapons by the SS men, being battered on their limbs. But the prisoners were brutalised, and the music covered up the screams of the prisoners and what was truly happening. One specific guard, who was known as Ivan the Terrible, then following a torture session, lit a cigarette, and he began to dance to the music on the radio that was being sent through the speaker system. Dachau concentration camp earned a reputation for torture and brutality, and the prisoners were subjected to a harrowing amount of violent treatment at the hands of the guards. The loudspeakers ranting Nazi propaganda and music was something the prisoners were forced to live with, and it was a terrifying reminder of their fate. But inside of Dachau, as it was the first camp, many of the guards learned their cruelty within the walls, and they then went to other camps such as Auschwitz. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.